Kitze,
Yeah.
down to the second video.
All right.
In the first, we talked about React and the things that you can block you when you're learning about React. Well, the logical next step is to talk about GraphQL and what happens when you're learning about GraphQL, what the things are that annoy you when you are learning about how to use GraphQL together with maybe React.
All right. There are a couple, like, the problems that you're going to stumble upon when learning GraphQL, I think they're much bigger than the problems you're going to stumble upon when learning React. So GraphQL is like an entire universe, and I think it's like the term GraphQL, most people don't understand it, and it just like scares them away. They think they need to rewrite everything at once in order to adopt GraphQL. Even when I was learning, I think it was 2016 when I first started hearing about this GraphQL thing that everyone is using. But I was so scared of the setup. I don't know why. Like, someone made it sound like GraphQL is this scary thing, and in order to adopt it, you need to have like all of these sets of tools and languages and frameworks and libraries. So I just took a glance at one of the setups at a conference that a developer had. And I'm like, this is overwhelming, this is too much, I don't want to learn this. So I think the first thing that people are going to stumble upon is, where do we start? Do we start from the backend? Do we start from the front end? Do we start from Apollo? Do we start from a framework? And so on. So my advice is just start from learning the GraphQL spec. So if you go to the GraphQL spec, like the official docs for GraphQL, what is it as a technology, as a transport layer, and you learn that, I think that could be the best like starting point. And then you decide if you, depending on your role, like if you're full stack, you want to cover it both on the front end and on the back end. If you're a front end developer, I still think that you should know a little bit about what's going on in the back end, because I think that every front end developer knows how REST works. So they're like, if I need a new API call, I'm just going to tell my backend engineers, hey, I need this API call and I need it to return this data. But with GraphQL, the game is changed because you're transporting all of the power from the backend to the client. So basically now the front-end developers, like on the client, you have the power to query whatever you want on the client. And you can do like some pretty stupid stuff when you have all the power on the client. So if you don't know how resolvers work on the backend and how combining like nesting queries and so on, how expensive they are to run on the backend.
Latency, right?
Yeah. You're going to query everything on the front end. Hey, I can query one API call and I'm going to get everything that I need. And you're not thinking like, how will the resolver work and how will that like data come from the database and so on. So that's why I think even as a front-end developer, if you're like diehard front-end and you don't want to learn anything about the backend, you can have an easy start with Node.js and GraphQL, and you can build your own GraphQL server just to see how will it work when I'm going to use it later on the front-end side.
Get some of the understanding of how
so
it works.
I still think that like front-end engineers and back-end engineers and vice versa. So also the back-end engineers should know what's going on the client, so they have a general idea, how is the client going to consume my API. So it's like in REST, I think we have a clearer separations. Like you just finish the API call, I just do the stuff on the front end. Now things are more like complex and they're more intertwined because like you need to communicate and talk together. Like GraphQL makes everything easier, but you need a lot of communication and you need to understand the other side of the story. So the backend needs to understand the front end.
So you need more learning upfront.
Yeah. So yeah, just to summarize, you need to start from the GraphQL schema, then understand how GraphQL servers work. You need to understand that you can write a GraphQL server in the same ways that you can write a REST server. So you can use any language, any technology. You can use Node.js, you can use Go, you can use Express with Node.js, you can use all of these layers on top of Node.js, on top of Express, on top of this, on top of that. You have all of these GraphQL frameworks. But at the end of the day, no matter what you use for the front end, it doesn't have much to do with the client. So no matter how the backend is written, just with like the REST API, you don't care like if the REST API was written in Scala or in Go. You just consume the REST API. So same thing. You need to understand how does it work, but it's not going to matter much if it's Scala or Go or Node.js. You just consume the API on the client.
Just you need to understand the mechanics of how it works behind.
Yeah.
Right?
And then another hard decision would be like which client library do we choose? Like for the backend, usually you already have a team, they're already using a language and they're going to continue using that language, just they're going to find a GraphQL framework and they're going to write the GraphQL framework. So that's not a hard decision. But on the client, you're starting from scratch, or you're starting from an app that already has Redux or has some sort of client state management library and so on. And you're like, now where do we start? Do we start with vanilla fetch? So we just treat the GraphQL API as it's REST and we're just fetching certain API calls and so on. You can start with that. But if you're starting with an app from scratch, you have a choice of a framework. So you have to choose, do I choose Apollo, or do I choose Relay, or do I choose Oracle? How do you pronounce Oracle? I don't know. It's from Formidable Labs.
And the answer is which one to choose?
Yeah, the hard thing is like which one to choose. Like Relay was the first one, but then it somehow lost the battle. And like I ran a poll lately on my Twitter, and like I think it was 50-50 between Apollo and just using vanilla fetch calls, but Relay had like a tiny small percent. You couldn't even see it on the poll. And like Facebook invented GraphQL, they invented Relay.
Right,
you would think that the two things would be like a popular combination, but Apollo right now is dominating the client. So I think the obvious choice for any beginner would be to choose the most popular thing, because it's like, I don't know, it's the most supported, it has all the docs, it has the community, you can ask questions on Stack Overflow and so on, you're going to get a lot of feedback. So I think Apollo would be the obvious choice. But on the other hand, I don't like it that Apollo is dominating, because I think they're the fact that they're dominating the GraphQL client side right now is making them more, I don't want to say lazy, but they're not innovating as much. I think there's still a lot of space for innovation for GraphQL on the client. Like if you combine GraphQL with client state management, you can get to some pretty amazing solution.
So you want more competition so that people try to innovate, right? Instead of Apollo winning the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think competition is good. And I see a couple of libraries popping up here and there with some innovative ideas, especially around the cache. I think the caching mechanism on the client side can be improved a lot.
It's complicated.
It's a complicated problem to solve, but I think the current, I don't want to complain about the current solution that we have, like it's way better than you doing your own cache with REST API calls and so on, but it could be way better, because when you're using GraphQL, you have the entire schema, so you can just introspect the schema, and from the schema, you have a lot of information. From that information, you can do all sorts of crazy things, especially on the client. So I'm still waiting for some like silver bullet solution for the client for consuming GraphQL and then doing something smarter with the client.
With all the information that we got.
Yeah, but to answer the question, obvious choice, you start with Apollo on the client. Yeah.
And like if we go to the queries, like when we started like to use some kind of GraphQL API, do you have any advices when you do like your queries? One of the things that you said, like don't try to fetch all the data together, because that might be expensive, right? Any other things that you would advise about when you are starting to work with as a client, querying a GraphQL API? What are the things to avoid?
Things to avoid. Well, yeah, as I said, you don't want to like fetch the entire thing in the beginning of the app. We had that actually for a client when we were using REST API, and because REST doesn't give you like the modularity of GraphQL, so you cannot say first I want this data and then I want to expand the query and fetch more data and fetch another fragment and so on, and then you don't have someone constructing the store for you. With the REST API, you're doing it by yourself. So at some point I was like, our team was like, we need this data and then we need more data, and we were like, wait, how much is the entire data for one user? Okay, it's not that much. How about when the user logs in, we just fetch everything for the user? It's not that expensive, and then we're sure that every portion of our app we have all the data ready, which was, I mean, it worked at the time, but it's not going to work with projects that are like massive and have like huge API calls and so on. So the advice is the same, because we're talking about React, right? How can we adopt GraphQL on the client? And basically, if you treat it just like React, and we're saying for React that we want to separate and modularize everything in small components, you apply the same thing with GraphQL. You want small queries. So when you look at a component, like you want to see the entire description of the component along with the data. So if you have a user and you have his blog posts, and you have for each blog post you have the comments, you don't want to do like a huge query if you don't need all the data. You want to fetch it step by step. So you want the data to arrive as soon as possible, so the user doesn't wait and he sees a loading screen and it goes on forever. And you just want to like modularize the data. So this part is loaded, and then you see a loading spinner, and that part is loaded, and then you see a loading spinner, and that part is loaded. So GraphQL enables you to achieve this easily by just splitting things into
modularizing your
queries.
GraphQL queries. It's something we talked also with Wes Boss about this, like how can you, the same way that you do components in React, you can do it with GraphQL. With
in order to reuse parts of your queries, you can use fragments. So the more fragments you have, it's easier to update the store, because you're not updating queries. Like let's say you fire a mutation, you want to update some data on the server, and then you want to update the client cache. You're going to have a pretty bad time if you just fetch queries like throughout your app instead of fetching fragments. Because if you have a lot of reusable fragments, then you can just go and update a certain fragment instead of updating 10 different queries. So yeah, smaller queries and use as many fragments as you can.
Cool. Thank you.